Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great delight to welcome you all here to the third and final of our seminars on Brexit, trade, future relationship. I would like to start by thanking 39X6 Chambers for hosting these events and UK and Changing Europe for providing all of the support. I'm delighted we've got three wonderful people to talk on the subject today of trade and where it's all going. First, we've got Timothy Lyons QC from 39X6 Chambers, who has helped organise these events. Secondly, we've got Adam Marshall. Adam and I spent much time together in around the Brexit referendum period talking Brexit. Adam has now got a life and is now working for Flint Global, having been Director General of the British Chamber of Commerce up until 2021. And thirdly, Ivan Rogers, who knows more about Brexit than anybody else probably in the world, but he was former permanent rep at the UK rep as it then was. He saw Brexit coming, he saw all of the problems, and he's been a very astute critic of Brexit ever since and the government handling of it. And finally, I hope we're going to be joined by Julian Braithwaite. He originally had to pull out at the last minute because he was travelling with the Foreign Secretary, but we think he would be joining us in the course of the seminar, and he will take questions from us, the panel, and from you, the audience. So if you have questions for him, please could you put it in the Q&A box. I'm going to start by giving the floor to Timothy Lyons, who's going to talk about the issues going forward with our trading relationship. He will speak for 10 minutes. He will then be followed by Adam and then Ivan, and then hopefully by that stage, Julian Braithwaite will have joined us. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'd make four entirely uncontroversial points to form a foundation for the rest of the webinar. Firstly, just to look at the Withdrawal Agreement and the TCA, its parties particularly, then to look at some elements of interpretation, third, application, and then solutions, short-term, long-term, or what? Well, let's start with the Withdrawal Agreement and the TCA. Two agreements, sure. Two parties forming one package. But there are clearly three important elements, and particularly when one comes to think about parties. We have the EU on one side, we have the UK, and we have Northern Ireland. And it's worth thinking about what they constitute in legal terms. On the one hand, we have the EU describing itself as a community of law, which is what the present President of the Commission has said. We are a community of law. That's a description that she takes from the first president of the European Economic Community. And what it alludes to is an entity for which law is the glue. You stick by the rules because without the rules, you really are nothing. You are a community of law. Then we have the UK in its new shiny incarnation as what the Trade and Cooperation Agreement calls an independent coastal state. We fish here, we fish there, and with due acknowledgement of the Gray report, we fish not there. We fish wherever we like, we do whatever we like, we're a sovereign nation. And so what I want to highlight, first of all, is the imbalance between those two. A rule-bound community of law and what I've called, lifting the title from the TCA, an independent coastal state. So that these two parties aren't exactly equivalents. Then there's a third element, Northern Ireland individuals, who under the Belfast Agreement can be British, can be Irish, or can be both. Now, I've no objection to that solution. Seems perfectly sensible, but I do want to highlight how extraordinary it is. Imagine if you were to tell President Macron that the inhabitants of Nice could fly the tricolore, or they could fly the tricolore. He'd be a bit confused. So there is something rather special about this. There's a confusion inherent in the nature of this area. And what it seems to me the protocol does is to translate a confusion inherent in the treatment of individuals into the sphere of the treatment of goods. So people say, well, the protocol is really most confusing, but that's deliberate, and it's a deliberate reflection of a legal reality relating to the individuals who live in that area. So yes, two agreements, two parties, but they aren't equivalent parties. And at least in respect of the United Kingdom, there is an element of ambiguity in one of them, which is really quite special. So if we start with that basis, then let's say one or two words about interpretation. Well, those of you who follow the litigation in Northern Ireland, if indeed that class of persons is larger than the litigants themselves, you will have seen that Lord Chief Justice Keegan has described the protocol in no doubt subdued judicial terms as a dense and complicated instrument. And that's, I think, a description that any lawyer who's had the task of reading the protocol will agree with. It is indeed a dense and complicated instrument, and yet the words are on the page and we have to make sense of whatever it is they say. And some people have said, well, do the words mean what they say? We have, for example, in Article 4, Northern Ireland in the UK Customs Union. Well, yeah, fair enough. And then in the next article, put conveniently in paragraph 3, just so that it doesn't catch the eye, Northern Ireland is subject to EU law. Well, to a lawyer, indeed to somebody who's not a lawyer, that might seem a rather unusual state of affairs. And indeed, it struck somebody as sufficiently unusual that they litigated about it. And here we move on to actually making these words work in the real world, their application. And in the petition of Jolyon Maugham, Lord Pentland said, I mean, if you're a judge, it must be ghastly sometimes to look back on what you said in the past. But anyway, this is what he said. The clear intention underlying the draft protocol, as it then was, is that Northern Ireland will remain part of the customs territory of the UK. Well, with that we've seen. There is nothing to show that this will not play out as intended and work in a satisfactory manner. Well, I suppose it depends how you interpret that statement. To be kind to the judge, he was, we may say, referring to what he had in evidence before him. He wasn't being asked to be a prophet, and maybe the evidence before him did indeed justify him saying there is nothing to show that it wouldn't play out as intended. But nevertheless, this conflict that is inherent in being in a customs territory, but applying the law of another customs territory, surely even in 2019 did ring some alarm bells for at least some litigants, and one can hardly blame them for thinking that there might be some difficulties here. In fact, the case of Jolyon-Morm was brought to determine the compliance of the protocol with various provisions of UK law, but it was held to be entirely compliant. And so we've heard no more about this litigation. But interpretation, what do the words mean? A dense and complicated instrument, they seem to be saying conflicting things. When you start to apply it, really nothing to show, it won't play out as intended. Well, clearly we know that not everybody would take that view now. And because Article 16 is one of those articles that is hitting newspapers, even within, even those who don't want to go into very much detail about the protocol, I think it was worth looking a little more at this notion of the application of the words, because Article 16 tells us that if the application of the protocol leads to serious economic, societal, or environmental difficulties that are liable to persist, or to diversion of trade, safeguard measures may be taken. One thing that I'll say before we start is I find the reference to diversion of trade interesting because you will know that customs unions are routinely analyzed by economists by reference to trade creation and trade diversion. The idea that you can go in and out of a customs union without diverting trade is really quite eccentric, I'd suggest. That's the point of them. So if there's no diversion of trade here, that would be, I'd suggest, a rather surprising result. But then we've got those other words. If the application of this protocol leads to all of those factors, then you can take safeguard measures. What does leads to mean? Is it causation? Or is it in a strict sense, or is it something else? Just because serious economic difficulties occur, is that good enough? But isn't that correlation? Or am I being too precise about this? The other thing to note is that safeguard measures are apparently to be reviewed every 3 months, which does anticipate perhaps that you aren't going to blow up the entire thing, because it might be rather satisfying to certain politicians to review the wreckage of the world every 3 months, but it's not probably what the protocol anticipated. So there we are. Peculiarities with the parties, peculiarities with the words, difficulties with the application. Finally, in the last minute or two, solutions. And when we talk about solutions, I just think it's helpful to look at the timescale of different sets of provisions in the Withdrawal Agreement and the TCA. I mean, the Withdrawal Agreement is an extraordinary document in the way that it treats citizens, because I think, as Catherine Barnard has pointed out on other occasions, the provisions actually can be applicable for a very, very long period of time, certainly much longer than my lifetime, or, with great respect and not wishing you at all ill, your lifetime. They can last probably, if you're being cautious, 80 years, and if you're believing in the advancement of medical science, probably 100 years. So that's an interesting perspective. Then we've got the protocol provisions, which give us a time scale. And they look at 4 yearly democratic consents, possibly an 8-year period, depending on the nature of the consent. So that's as it were, at the other end of the scale. And then we have the TCA provisions on rebalancing, review, partial termination, full termination, and anything else you care to think of. Well, they are a variety of time periods in question there. But, some of those periods are really only a year long. So we have this interesting range of short-term and long-term elements to these agreements, which leads me to ask, in view of that, what kind of solutions are we going to be looking at? Are we looking at short-term solutions? Are we looking at long-term solutions? In other words, are we looking at permanent solutions, or are we looking at temporary solutions? Well, bearing in mind that we have trouble with the parties, we have trouble with interpretation, and we have trouble with application, I'd suggest if we get solutions of any kind, we should be very grateful. So,
on that
note,
thank you. Can I just take this opportunity to thank you, Timothy, and also to welcome Julian Braithwaite, who's kindly joined us. You very kindly agreed to take some questions towards the end, Julian, and I encourage the audience to put some questions in the Q&A box. Adam, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Catherine, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join such an eminent group today. My comments, unsurprisingly, stem entirely from the perspective of business. And throughout the Brexit process, I had the unenviable job of articulating some of the concerns and needs of trading firms to a government whose officials were definitely listening, but sometimes whose politicians were not. After all, despite some of the misconceptions of our politicians, it's businesses ultimately, not nations or blocs, that trade. Governments set the conditions for that trade to happen, but of course it's those in business who take the decision to buy and sell across borders. And I've always felt like in the EU-UK relationship in Whitehall and Westminster, that distinction is overlooked. Let's look at the data, though, of what's happened to the trading relationship. We've had a lot of statistics on this over just the past couple of weeks. First, there's less trade overall flowing between the UK and the EU in both directions. The thickness of the business relationships across that divide has eroded somewhat. I think it's still early to say how much of that is structural and permanent and how much of it is cyclical and pandemic related. Businesses do have a way of stopping, adapting, restarting. I think we should watch the medium-term trends on this because the story hasn't yet been written in full. But what we can say with a very high degree of certainty is that a lot of businesses and SMEs in particular have simply opted out of UK-EU trade for now. And I thought that the LSE Centre for Economic Performance work on that just a few weeks ago demonstrated that very clearly. Now, our politicians are willing to put any story they want on this. They'll blame it on anything that's convenient, from COVID to war in Ukraine to everything else. But there is a clear Brexit effect on the thickness of those trading relationships. And I think it's very important to say that. Now, after a decade plus at the British Chambers of Commerce, none of that is a surprise for me at all. And when I left the BCC, the one thing I did think might happen was that the political instability around the process would start to take a back seat. And yes, there would continue to be technical negotiations and continue to be discussions between the parties, but that some of the politics would recede. Well, clearly that was an underestimation on my part. I thought we'd be talking about the technicalities of customs procedures or testing requirements or various other things, but it would be a technocratic discussion, at least until some of those review points in the TCA come up. But of course, I was wrong on that, and the politics are very much back in the frame. And they bring into question, of course, the durability of the relationship. And here are some of the things that businesses are asking about. Well, of course, the fate of the protocol, which Timothy talks about in some detail there, is a key business concern. I think businesses trading across the channel fear becoming the collateral damage of a dispute over the protocol as tariffs are imposed or facilitations withdrawn in some way. A trade war is rising up business risk registers. It's causing real disquiet. And whilst there are many in government that do see that prospect and are trying to think about its wider impacts, I think the rhetoric that we're seeing at political level is extremely unhelpful. So I think businesses would like to see the PM, Foreign Secretary, and others tone down the rhetoric for the domestic political audience and focus more on the detail of what changes would make life easier in the protocol for East-West trade. And I'd note that no Northern Ireland business organisation has expressed support for the government's proposed plans for legislation. Yes, that tells you quite a lot. So perhaps a focus on the technical rather than on the political would be helpful to diffuse some of the issues. Another thing businesses are watching carefully is around data. Obviously, the UK and the EU have a data adequacy process in place right now. That's positive and was something that was a great worry ahead of the agreement of the TCA, and indeed in the weeks immediately following. But the UK now has stated its intention to seek data adequacy agreements with other global powers, including the USA and Australia. Be very interesting to see if that has an impact on the UK-EU data adequacy agreement there. I think the fact that the EU and the US are talking again on data could diffuse this somewhat, but it's not guaranteed that they could reach agreement. And of course, the ECJ has weighed in on data issues quite a lot in the past, and we underpriced perhaps the importance of that to businesses. So I thought I'd raise it here. And I think it's also important to look at, as Timothy mentioned, some of the review points in the TCA. I think the time bombs built in there around fishing and energy, not very many businesses will be aware of them, but could provoke another roller coaster for firms as we head towards 2026 and those review points. Now, interesting, we'd sort of assume that the inbuilt inflection point would work against the UK because the impact of the withdrawal of energy arrangements as a tit for tat in terms of a dispute over fishing would have a far greater economic impact on us. But it's impossible to say what that will look like in 2026 because right now, of course, the provisions would work in the UK's favour if that happened today, because we're supplying energy to Europe through the same interconnectors and serving as Europe's offshore LNG terminal at the moment and offshore wind powerhouse as well. So, the changing geopolitical situation could in fact change the way that those provisions play out for business and in politics later on. Then, of course, there's also the ratchet in place around the rules of origin for batteries for electric vehicles, which both sides are eyeing carefully and racing to meet. And there are the legal disputes that businesses have already seen. So the EU WTO case against the UK on local content requirements for wind farms has already raised a number of eyebrows amongst firms. So questions around durability, there are plenty of those out there. Now, just very quickly, if we could get over the current level of tension and get back to the table and think constructively, what would be possible or desirable to do in the TCA to support businesses? How could it evolve? First point I'd make is one which I made whilst at the BCC and will continue to make: enhanced customs collaboration and simplification. It cannot be out with our mutual capabilities to streamline and reduce the level of customs bureaucracy that we currently see between the two jurisdictions if the political will should be there. I think the asymmetric regime that's in place right now with EU customs authorities demanding the right font or the right pen color and the UK doing absolutely nothing at all is an imbalance which could cause problems later on. But the two sides could come to the table and look at mutual facilitations at the border, greater data sharing, reductions in bureaucracy to the benefit of businesses on both sides. That would be a constructive move forward. Similarly, greater flexibility on accumulation in rules of origin to support complex supply chains is something that the two sides could look at in future. What about a mutual recognition agreement for conformity assessment for testing bodies? Now, that was a political casualty of the bad blood in the negotiation of the TCA itself. But if the EU has MRAs in place with Australia, with the US and Israel, the UK has them separately with those markets, plus elements of them with Japan and Switzerland. We could save money and save time for businesses on both sides of the channel very quickly, because we both know that each other's testing arrangements are more than adequate and up to the task. Horizon Europe, let's unblock the UK's association and participation in Horizon Europe to mutual benefit. And indeed, let's get back to the discussion on the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, something which I know in the legal sector in particular is of enormous interest indeed. So there are threats to the durability of the agreement for businesses right now, concerns about the political rhetoric they're hearing, but also areas where they think improvements could occur over the long term. And I hope, Catherine, that we get ourselves eventually to territory where we can focus on the improvements, not necessarily just on the political rows.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for both your comments, but also your positivity and what's available. I turn now to Sir Ivan Rogers, who is endlessly positive. Ivan, the floor is yours.
Quite right. I feel obliged now to start on a positive note, which was no doubt your intention. First of all, thanks very much for having me, and a real pleasure to join this session and to listen to such distinguished and very helpful contributions. I think just in response to Adam, and I'm sorry, I will obviously cease the positivity at some point, because I don't think he's going to get, or business is going to get, too much of what he quite sensibly asks for, at least in the next 2 or 3 years. I think, in fairness to the current administration, and people might not expect me to say this, quite a lot of the TCA was an inevitable consequence of the version of Brexit chosen. And the version of Brexit chosen, even though I think we could have done a better TCA, particularly on the points on trade facilitation that Adam just mentioned, I never really believed that an option involving staying in the single market was viable, both for free movement reasons and for rule-taking reasons in financial services in particular, and Bank of England Treasury positions, as well as Home Office positions. I personally never believed that staying in the customs union was a politically viable proposition inside the Conservative Party, and I think I was proven right. So I disagreed with Ollie Robbins from the start there. And it didn't surprise me that in the end, his version of Brexit, May's version of Brexit, couldn't get through his own party. But actually what they came up with at the time of the Chequers Agreement couldn't get through the European Union either. So, of course, let's not rehearse the history. But I mean, I think we wasted a lot of time going down blind alleys. We could have spent more time, and I think we should have spent more time on customs collaboration, trade facilitation. You know, I had 1 or 2 very interesting conversations before the referendum with the guy who's just ceased to be the Secretary General of the Council, who's both trade literate and highly sophisticated. And I explained to him, wrongly as it turned out, given where May and Robbins went, that I thought we would go for a very thin free trade deal. We would be more mid-Atlantic than they wanted. We would be much further out than Norway or Switzerland or even Turkey, which after all has a customs union, and that therefore the focus would have to be on customs collaboration, and the rubber would hit the road on customs collaboration and facilitation when it came to Northern Ireland. I mean, we knew all this in 2016. That's what exasperates me sometimes about the current debate. All of this was known, all of it was being talked about by those of us who understood it on both sides of the table well before we got to the referendum, let alone afterwards. And it's not surprising we've ended up with a kind of Northern Ireland crisis, because there's no optimal solution to the Northern Ireland trilemma. I mean, you know, we were all writing diagrams of the Northern Ireland trilemma before the referendum. They've then spawned a cottage industry since. It's not surprising. This is an intrinsically incredibly difficult, intractable, close to insoluble problem where there isn't an optimal solution for all parties. And we knew that from the outset. Now, I won't detain you, and we'll hear more from Julian, I'm sure, about where we stand on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Obviously, it is the blockage to the things that Adam wants, and the poison around the Northern Ireland Protocol and the accusations of bad faith flying from both sides of the table make me pessimistic that Adam would get what he wants. You know, for example, I think Horizon 2020, I think it's gone, to be honest, Adam, and I don't think the UK will participate as an associate member, and I think it will do its own thing and set up an alternative proposition. And I think that's worse from the point of view of UK science and EU science than if we'd found a solution. But the problem is the Northern Ireland Protocol dispute contaminates everything else. And if I'm very honest with this audience, I don't think that's about to change. And obviously, if we do go down the route that Liz Truss signalled of unilateral legislation, I think it's actually about to get worse, because I think that will trigger a freeze on all positive cooperation by the EU, except in the Ukraine-Russia domain, a reopening of the legal proceedings, proceeding with those legal proceedings, and further retaliatory threats to take safeguard measures, which in my view they can do, and they don't require unanimity to do, if the UK proceeds with its unilateral route. So I suppose my main message to this audience is, if that's where we're heading within 3 to 4 weeks, and there was obviously briefing yesterday to the effect that it might be only that distance away, I think if you get into that, to get to that point, it's extremely difficult to keep any sort of good faith negotiation on the road on both sides. I mean, I've been through lots of these kinds of negotiations, obviously nothing completely analogous to this one because we remember at the time, but if the feeling on both sides of the table is that the other party has essentially given up trying or given up bothering and has chosen a different route because it wants to establish facts on the ground and wants to allege that its action is legal. And I'm sure the UK similarly thinks that Brussels has not tried hard enough to mitigate the concerns it has about the way in which the protocol is operating. Then, you know, we are in danger of being lost because I think, you know, both parties conclude there's nowhere to go and both parties then make, you know, sufficient, you know, if you inevitably, if one side puts a gun on the table, as the Prime Minister described his own behaviour, the other side thinks, well, I've got a bigger and better gun and I'll put that on the table as well. And unless you take your gun off the table, then we're not resuming negotiation. You know, we've all been in these sterile situations before, and we're very close to another very difficult sterile situation with pretty explosive politics. Now, I will turn to the good news, Catherine, because I think there is some good news. The question is, can that good news be extended elsewhere? We face in the real world the worst security crisis of our lifetimes, the worst aggression on European soil since the Second World War. On that, the EU and the UK and the US have worked remarkably well together. And in comparison with the days when Julian and I were there, both doing this business in 2014, it's a much more concerted, much more determined, much more rigorous and much better response. It has also shocked Europe and the UK, I would argue, on some fundamental areas of policy. So, I mean, German energy policy, which often drove me mad, it was utterly wrong-headed in my view and mercantilist in the Merkel era, has basically exploded. So has a significant element of German foreign policy really of the last 30 years. But let's not be too pious about it. There's quite a lot that the UK was doing on oligarchs and golden visas and the London laundromat and plenty else, some of which I hope we tried to tackle under David Cameron in my time as his G7 Sherpa, but we failed to do very much about it in practice. You know, we've got our own blemishes on our record and our own complacency, I think, across the Western world about, you know, what we were dealing with in dealing with this Russian regime and dealing with Putin. That's gone. I think that's utterly good news. And I think on issues like sanctions, you're seeing quite close cooperation between the UK and the EU. The problem is on sanctions, of course, essentially we agree, and essentially we are on the same side and we're trying to do the same thing and we're trying to make those sanctions work, whether in the financial sector or in the energy sector or in any other sector. And therefore there's a tremendous incentive to use G7 architecture or whichever other architecture to get these things right. And I think what I think is missing, and I'll stop here, Catherine, and I'll just allude to the problem, is particularly on the non-defense side, on the economic NATO side, we're using the G7 architecture on sanctions and plenty else on economic statecraft because the G20 has blown up because the Russians are in the room and you've seen the walkouts from Western players. Can one imagine the G20 performing in this sort of crisis the role it performed for Gordon Brown under the UK presidency in 2009 on the financial crisis? No, because the G20 is not remotely united and isn't unitable on these issues. Maybe you could still do some things in the G20 on, you know, climate change, climate finance, various of those issues where you can keep that sufficiently apart from everything else going on. But even there, I have my doubts. But there's a welter of other things, some of them alluded to by Adam, you know, data. Look at Janet Yellen's speech, well worth reading her speech of April, where she talks about basically the end of the old multilateral order, the collapse of fully multilateral globalization. She seems to welcome this rather more than I would, but that's the spirit in Washington, and it's a widely praised speech. But she talks, for example, about the need for more harmonization of data provisions on data adequacy and data protection and data privacy across the Western world. Well, one interesting question, is the UK up for that? I mean, the UK made a great merit of departing GDPR and wanting to forge its own path and doing something markedly different. But I only cite data as one of, you know, you could talk about artificial intelligence, you could talk about satellites, you could talk about 6G and the experience of 5G, where we ended up dependent on Huawei and our national security services concluded that this was a wholly unpalatable place to be, particularly in the current context. There's a whole range of very fundamental regulatory and economic issues, particularly at a time of massive supply chain disruptions across the world, which is contributing to an inflationary crisis, the primary cause of which is quantitative easing and monetary policy. These are issues on which the Western world collectively, perhaps it's not just the Western world, perhaps it's also Asian partners outside the Western world, but it's certainly the liberal democratic world, needs something much more fundamental to be happening than is covered by what we're doing at the moment. And it needs something much more fundamental than anything we have in the TCA machinery. And just briefly, if you look at what the EU and US are doing, for example, in the Trade and Tech Council, which seems to me to be working much better than the EU and US were working together on TTIP, 7 or 8 years ago, which I was heavily involved in. I think that's a good development. I think it's necessary between the EU and US. I think it'll be a very hard grind to get to common positions which then have legal standing, but I think it's necessary on a number of very big ticket items. I also think, I'm afraid, it's necessary between the UK and the EU. And at the moment, because of the very, very thin structures that we have on the TCA and the determination of the government really to go down a route which was tariff-free, tariff quota free, but had remarkably little substance on the regulatory order, because the doctrine, after all, was we were deliberately departing in order to diverge as much as possible from the European Union, or at least to be free so to do. I think we were living in a world in 2016 that no longer exists in 2022. So it's not just German economic policy which has blown up, although I personally think it has, over its energy policy, which was, after all, cheap Russian hydrocarbons imported, and then a massive export surplus and a massive export industry focused on, above all, on the Chinese market, but also dominating a lot of the European market. That model is dead, in my view. But I think there's an awful lot about our own model and about other models across the Western world is dead. And somehow the Western world has to have a much more systematic and deeper discussion about what to do. And we need fora in which to do that, some of which are going to have to involve EU and UK interaction on a much deeper scale than we've got at the moment. I'll shut up there.
Thanks a million, Ivan. That's really very helpful indeed. And just before I move over to Julian, could I just point out to the audience something that I totally failed to pick up until very recently, which is a document that the European Commission has published. It's their proposal for a regulation which gives the Commission the power to take action under Article 16 or under any of the provisions. For those of you who've not seen it, it's COM 2022-89, and I'm surprised how little attention this document has had more widely, because it means that the Commission can act by implementing measures without waiting for decisions of the Council.
They don't have to wait on the Council.
No, and it's only a draft regulation at the moment, but it looks like it will go through. Julian, first of all, many, many thanks indeed for joining us. I'm hugely grateful to you. I realise you're extraordinarily busy, and I also realise that your plans have been thrown up in the air, so I'm really grateful that you've kindly agreed to join us. There are some questions coming in on the Q&A. I encourage the audience to put any more questions in, but if I could start with a fairly gentle question. TCA working well?
Well, it's a short question. Very nice to see all of you, and very nice to see Ivan, of course, who I worked with very closely in Brussels back in the day. In one sense, the TCA has worked. As we all know, it's a much more straightforward agreement than the Withdrawal Agreement. It's a tariff-free, quota-free FTA. In terms of the governance of it, the architecture of it, it's been established. All of the committees of the many specialized committees of the TCA have met. There have been technical discussions which haven't really troubled the media because they've been largely technical, and there have been progress on fleshing out various aspects of it and ancillary parts of it, like air cargo agreements, etc. The most difficult element of the implementation of the TCA that took place was, and it was always going to be difficult, was the introduction of a new fishing licensing regime between the EU and the UK. And I mean, that was an interesting process that sort of dominated our relationships with the EU and particularly with France in the autumn of last year. But by the end of it, actually, and I think DEFRA did a very good job on this, by sticking to a reasonable interpretation of our obligations under the treaty and then looking at reasonable ways of implementing them, we managed, I think, to see through to the end a process that actually, despite French threats at various stages of unilateral action of all sorts, including causing trouble in the short straits, ultimately, we ended up in a position where we were working closely with the Commission in a way where the Commission was clear to us that they were not supporting all of the French positions on this. And by the end of it, we sort of managed to land it. I mean, it was extremely difficult, and it took place against the backdrop of all sorts of other complications in the UK-French relationship, including the migrant, the small boats issue, the announcement of AUKUS, etc. So I think in terms of the TCA's implementation, that has been fine, and it works fine. I mean, the problem, of course, has been the outstanding business of the implementation of the Withdrawal Agreement and the connection that the EU has made between that and the implementation of the TCA, which, you know, legally is quite, you know, is quite a bold move in terms of how they are connected. But in practice, what the EU has done has gone slow in terms of implementing aspects of the TCA that they think, we think are important. And the association with the union programs is a very good example of that. There's a protocol to the TCA that said we would associate to union programs. It's just quite a technical matter that would be take place after the relevant regulation had come into force in 2021. Of course, that didn't happen, and Ukraine and other countries have associated. But what's quite interesting is that, I mean, obviously this is linked to the Northern Ireland Protocol, but what's interesting is that we're actually in the same position as Switzerland, who are also discovering that their association with cooperation programs with the EU has been held hostage over their negotiations, over their own institutional agreement. So it's something that happened for the Swiss actually last time round as well. And so they have been, you know, they've been talking to us about what we could do together about this. And I think Ivan is right that particularly given likely developments, our association with those programs anytime soon is unlikely. And at some point you get to a point where the Treasury will tell you the cost benefit analysis doesn't stack up anymore in terms of putting in 17 billion pounds worth of taxpayers' money into this 100 billion euro program, and you better use it otherwise. And we will, there's a risk we will get to that point. I think it's quite serious risk we get to that point in the course of this year while we're still working through the implications of the protocol. So that's a long answer to your short question.
Thank you. I mean, your point about Northern Ireland Protocol obviously is one that's very live, and we've got a couple of questions here. The first one says, in the Internal Markets Bill, the government conceded that unilateral action to change the Northern Ireland Protocol would break international law in, as is well known, a very limited and specific way. Now it says it wouldn't break international law at all. What has changed?
So, I mean, I think the government's legal, there'll be a summary of the government's legal position that I think will be published as and when draft legislation is introduced. And I hesitate in front of such a distinguished audience of lawyers to try and explain the doctrines behind this position. But
we're very happy for you to try.
I'm sure. It is, I mean, yeah, so, I mean, the big difference, and, you know, I mean, before I even consider whether or not to attempt to get into the actual legal, but the big difference obviously is that back in when we were introducing the Internal Markets Bill, the government's legal advice was that this would not be consistent with our obligations, international obligations. Indeed, a minister therefore stood up in Parliament to say so, and of course that then became the clear evidence that the UK was going to be breaking its international agreements, and actually was admitting it itself. And that is, the circumstances then and circumstances now are different. There's the issue of the impact the protocol has had on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and the balance of that, and what that means for stability in Northern Ireland and for the functioning of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement institutions, and that plays into the legal advice about taking action to address that. As I say, it's a conversation that I hesitate to sort of get into more detail on before we've actually published what our legal advice is. But as you saw from the Foreign Secretary's statement last week, this is legal according to our the government's legal advice on this, and therefore it's a different proposition from the internal market.
So your own internal lawyers have advised that it is compatible with public international law as well?
So as I say, I think the Foreign Secretary's words, and I would go back to them. I mean, we will publish a summary of the government's legal position when we bring forward the legislation, and I think I'd probably leave it at that, given I'm in some tricky territory. Actually be able to pass every word that I say.
There's another question here on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which says, what are the possible ways of moving away from brinkmanship, Northern Ireland Protocol, internal market built towards a more integrative strategy? I think probably it's my suspicion from the name, it's not a native speaker, but to perhaps a more even keel relationship.
I mean, and it is clear that until we've worked our way through the protocol, I mean, the sort of things that Adam is talking about, which is absolutely the sort of things that the government will want to do as we review the TCA, we're clearly not going to be there until we've found a way of compartmentalizing, stabilizing the relationship around the protocol. I mean, the introduction of legislation, as and when it happens, obviously won't change anything on the ground in Northern Ireland. It will be the beginning of a legislative process that I think those of you will understand this and have studied this much more than I, but I think you'll understand it's going to take months, this process, potentially many months. In the meantime, nothing changes on the ground in Northern Ireland, and there's a sort of, there's a conversation we're having with the Commission and with the member states at the moment about how they plan to react to our introduction of legislation, and so far they're looking at sort of moving in parallel to us. So in response to a statement by the Foreign Secretary in the House of Commons, Maros Sefcovic issued his statement, which was, I mean, it could have been, in terms of the rhetoric, it could have been a lot more. There could have been a lot more rhetoric. Actually, it was quite a moderate statement. It didn't say how the EU would react at the next stages of this process, although it did say they would. So the question will be, what will they do when we introduce legislation? And the point we're making to them is, look, this process is going to take months. We are, our preferred outcome is a negotiated outcome. That's clearly preferable. We want to keep the space open for negotiations after legislation has been introduced. We understand your position about responding to each of our steps, but we will do nothing when we introduce legislation that will change the situation on the ground in Northern Ireland, and therefore we hope you will do nothing when you respond in a way that changes the situation on the ground in Northern Ireland. And of course, that's really a conversation about the standstill, how it works at the moment, and the fact that it's, we are, both sides are sort of operating the protocol on the basis of it not being fully implemented at the moment. I mean, we have extended all of the grace periods from last year. We had a negotiation last summer where the sort of Commission agreed to turn a blind eye when we basically extended all of the ones that were coming up in the autumn, and that's the basis of the standstill today. It's one of the reasons why the Commission's proposals, the October proposals that we've been negotiating on, while full credit to the Commission team for being imaginative about how they're, the proposals they've come forward with, and they would certainly be better than the full implementation of the protocol. In practice, they will look worse if we agree to them than the status quo. So we've said to the Commission that this isn't a this isn't a basis for a sustainable solution, because if we agreed to these proposals today, the first thing that would happen would be introducing yet more checks and process for business rather than removing them. And that's not a sellable proposition. We need to move further in the direction of reducing the barriers, particularly to the East-West relationship. That's a long answer again.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. I've got one more question on the Northern Ireland Protocol from Adam Marshall, and then there's another question on an unrelated issue that I'd like to ask you about. Adam, the floor's yours.
Thanks, Catherine. Julian, you started to answer this in your last response, but leaving aside the merits of whether legislation is a good idea or a bad idea, you said you don't want to do anything to change the reality on the ground in Northern Ireland. I think a lot of businesses would feel reassured if you were to say, we will continue during this process to pursue technical negotiations on what can be done to ease the trading situation east to west, whilst trying to deal at 30,000 feet with some of the politics that inevitably comes around all of this. I think a lot of businesses wonder whether the government is just giving up on those technical negotiations, whether it's on the basis of the EU's October proposition or indeed the UK's own package of technical fixes. Are we going to continue to pursue those? Because if that takes the sting out, would that not be a good thing?
So, I mean, that is certainly, I mean, the plan. I mean, the Commission and the EU will quite reasonably say, well, look, we've put together a whole bunch of proposals to basically help the implementation of the protocol. We're not going to open up or change the protocol. We've all said that to you many times. Glad to hear that you're still open for negotiations, but on what basis is that going to be? And aren't you setting preconditions that we need to change our mandate, etc. So it's going to be a complex bit of choreography, and it's clearly not guaranteed to succeed. But there's a sort of conversation first about how we don't close down the space for negotiations after the introduction of legislation. How do we actually ensure that we don't end up getting ourselves into an escalatory sort of tit for tat that actually leads to the sort of things that Ivan was talking about earlier? I mean, I'm sure we will hear all of the sort of the things that the EU will do if we actually enact the legislation. But I don't think the question that they are considering now is, in terms of restarting the infringement proceeding, in terms of in terms of introducing perhaps an arbitration dispute, the question for them is to what extent that will actually close down that space. And I think they are also interested in keeping that space open. I mean, they are obviously taking a judgment as to whether or not there is any negotiation to be had after we've basically said, look, we've talked to you about your proposals, but we just don't think they're going to work unless you're also prepared to make some changes to the protocol. Our point is that some of the real problems with East-West trade, and certainly if you're looking at state aid or VAT, they're sort of baked into the protocol. Unless you actually can make some changes to the protocol, you can't actually address those problems. But first of all, we need to be to be credible in saying we are open for negotiations on a basis that don't seem so completely unacceptable to the EU that they say that's not really serious. And secondly, that we're clear that there are the objectives of the protocol we firmly support, and large aspects of the way the protocol operates we will obviously continue to support and uphold.
Thank you. There's another question here, unrelated to the protocol. Says there was no agreement on civil justice cooperation between the UK and the EU, and the EU has advised against the UK joining Lugano, the Lugano Convention. Is there a route ahead for closer collaboration between the UK and the EU on cross-border matters? Now, and the question actually goes on just beyond Lugano, and I think which was a question that we've picked up earlier on in these seminars about what's going to happen to services and mobility too. So might you do Lugano, services and mobility in succinctly in 3 or 4 minutes?
So I mean, it's true that we want to join Lugano. That hasn't been possible. We've actually looked at a range of other measures that would allow us to help mitigate that, and that's what we're currently looking to take forward. I mean, it's, you know, we certainly haven't given up on joining Lugano, and it is possible that, again, you know, the actual, you know, the current relationship and the difficulties around the protocol, and more widely difficulties with France, I think, played into that, and actually being able to return to this issue at a later date is something that we certainly have not, you know, we certainly haven't ruled out. I mean, in terms of sort of services, and I suppose one of the key aspects of the TCA that, of course, hasn't been implemented is the MOU on financial services. I mean, that again, it's clear, you know, that's been negotiated, it's ready to go. It sort of, you know, would have been quite useful if it had entered into force last year. It's not really going to change, you know, things dramatically, but it's a useful forum for dialogue in particular. That again is being held up on the EU side by the protocol. I mean, there are real questions about whether or not the EU has implemented its obligations under the TCA, actually, if you look at some of them. And they are, and we've started to sort of drill down in some of this, particularly around union programs. You know, one specialised committee, for example, that did not meet last year, or wasn't going to meet, was the one on union programs, because the EU wouldn't hold it. We pointed out that actually they would be absolutely breached their obligations if that didn't happen in the first year of the implementation of the TCA. So they held it on the 23rd of December. You know, that MOU on financial services is on hold. I mean, more generally, I mean, this isn't a sort of an answer in the EU context, but one of the things we've discovered is the Swiss are also actually being frozen out in a similar way across the piece because of the problems they're having with their institutional framework negotiations. And so we have actually now sat down with Swiss and said, okay, well, why don't we start thinking about what we could do in terms of R&D cooperation agreement, about what we might do in terms of MRAs on and an MOU on financial services. So the president of Switzerland came here a few weeks ago, and we've sort of started consultations on an FTA and a host of flanking agreements around that, which we will be good in and of themselves, and they potentially offer an opportunity to actually develop some quite sophisticated models of how you could do this differently in Europe if there was a will to do it.
My final point is one that comes up a lot, which is about mobility of people. And indeed, Lord Frost seemed to suggest that perhaps they, in the negotiation, he'd taken a very tough line, which has not been helpful to young people who want to go and, you know, work in a bar in the south of Spain for a year, or on the ski slopes or whatever. Is there any likelihood of movement there to do something at a minimum, a youth mobility program?
So that, I mean, that's something, I mean, one of the interesting question is will this need to be done at the EU level, or could you do it member state by member state? And that, the jury is a bit still out on that. There are some big member states that actually do want to do this. And so it'll be interesting whether or not the Commission then stops them. For example, the Spanish are very keen to talk to us about this. And we're quite interested to talk to them about it. So there's a question as to how this will move forward, but the issue will be to what extent it ends up being done member state by member state, and to what extent it ends up being done by, you know, has to be done by the EU. But at the moment, we are talking to several member states, sort of in a very preliminary way about that.
On that positive note, our time is up. I wanted to thank you, Julie, in particular, for coming in and fielding a range of questions, which of course are causing a lot of people difficulty, no doubt you in particular, but I'm very grateful for you for being prepared to engage with us. I also want to thank very warmly our panelists, Timothy Lyons, Adam Marshall and Sir Ivan Rogers, for just being wonderful in talking trade in all of its many forms. Finally, my thanks to the good people at 39 Essex Chambers who are behind the tiles, who kept the whole show on the road. And for those of you who missed either of the earlier programmes, they've been recorded and they are on the 39 Essex Chambers website. But thank you all very much indeed. Thank you and goodbye.
Cheers.